I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of 360 Thought Leadership Consulting. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, The ABCs of Webinar Success, Building the Bridge to Sales Growth. Billions of dollars are spent each year by organizations delivering or sponsoring webinars. Unfortunately, most fail to deliver the ROI that attendees deserve for their time, let alone the sales growth that companies that invest in delivering or sponsoring these webinars desire. The desired outcomes of all parties involved in a webinar should go hand in hand. A great webinar will draw great attendance, produce happy attendees, and deliver the sales leads that organizations need to deliver top-line sales growth. Today our content will focus on how to develop, market, and execute a webinar to deliver sales growth while also conveying thought leadership and building your company's brand. I would like to thank the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce for their support in marketing this webinar. 360 Thought Leadership Consulting is proud to be a member of the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce. A quick note on today's agenda. First, I will deliver my presentation, and then we'll move to our interactive Q&A session where we will spend the remainder of our time. I would like this to be an interactive experience for you, so if you have any questions at any time, please go to the questions area in the GoToWebinar control panel and send me your questions. I can't promise to get all of them in, but I'll do my best, and we'll follow up afterwards on any questions I do not get to today. A quick word about 360 Thought Leadership Consulting. Our company's mission is to fuel the ROI of thought leadership. Best-in-class educational programs in conjunction with innovative marketing channel development can lead to competitive advantage. We are all about putting strategy into thought leadership and building the bridge to increase revenue for each and every marketing program. A quick logistical note, I will send a link to the presentation to all attendees later this afternoon. Okay, let's get started with an overview of our content agenda. We will begin with the value proposition for a webinar as a business development channel, and in doing so, discuss the decision to become involved with the webinar as opposed to a live seminar. Then we'll shift to a brief discussion of the webinar ownership delivery versus sponsor decision. Just note, many of the issues and best practices are the same whether you own your own webinar or sponsor a webinar being delivered by another organization. Any involvement in a webinar involves valuable marketing spend whose ROI needs to be optimized. Subsequently, we'll have a little fun and discuss some common webinar pitfalls and stories of mine from the field in managing and monitoring more than 100 webinars. Next, we will discuss how to drive webinar success by focusing on the ABCs of a successful webinar: superior content, marketing, execution, and momentum. I like to call CMEM. I will then deliver practical and actionable advice for your companies to use in optimizing webinar ROI. And finally, I will close the webinar with the interactive Q&A session and some final thoughts. Again, submit questions at any time during the webinar using the questions area in your GoToWebinar control panel. How can webinars drive business development? Well, in theory, behind that as a business development channel, it can allow companies to acquire qualified leads, and in the best case, decision makers at their target companies within the target industries. They also allow you the opportunity to deliver value to your target constituency, and they also allow you to convey thought leadership. The last 2 points together help your client base see that you are actually a partner as opposed to being an organization that focuses on transactions. Webinars can also impact your brand awareness. They can also strengthen customer relationships, as if you truly convey thought leadership, theoretically you will help the employees of your customers become better at their jobs, and that will strengthen your customer relationships. So it's not all about business development, it's about strengthening customer relationships. And of course, webinars is value to drive that new business. So when considering a webinar, you may want to consider the value of a webinar versus a live seminar as a business development channel. And subsequently, you also need to consider the sponsor versus the webinar ownership decision. So let's take a little moment here and look at, okay, why a webinar versus a live in-person seminar? Oftentimes, a webinar will involve a lower cost commitments on several fronts. One would be travel costs, which would be the cost of your employees to go and run logistics of the event, and also potentially the speaker costs as well. If you are having a client of yours come in and speak, often there's reimbursement for travel costs, and so there's your employees' time and the time of your customer. So oftentimes marketing gold is the case studies. So, so if you're going to ask your customer to endure that travel cost, there's going to be the cost of their time as well. You need to consider the value there of a webinar, which is a lot easier for them to prepare for and be involved in versus a seminar. I mentioned there are also lower logistics costs. You would avoid the cost of the venue, the food, the badges, etc., all those costs. And in general, there can be lower speaker preparation costs. Many times seminars are longer and require more preparation and coordination on the front side. And of course, everyone has more and more to do in today's world with less time to do it, and webinars are just much more convenient for attendees. People don't need to leave the office, and that's critical. Even though people are more and more staying connected, it's still critical. The convenience of a webinar is very appealing for attendees. A webinar also allows folks to have a greater geographic reach. So a seminar is in a city, so expecting people to travel for a seminar is becoming tougher and tougher. And if you're marketing a webinar, not only can you get a broad domestic audience, you can also engage international audience as well. And then along with that, you have a greater registrant prospect constituency. So a webinar is often superior in the terms of the number of leads, in terms of lead acquisition. Now, I will caution, of course, we'll talk about this later, quality versus quantity, but oftentimes a webinar is going to give you a much higher quantity of leads as well. Again, just to reiterate a couple things, it's important to consider the cost of time, your speakers and staff, in considering a webinar versus a seminar decision. So the next kind of point of decision is going to be whether you want to sponsor or deliver and own your own webinar. Many times people will automatically default to sponsor a webinar versus delivering their own webinar, and there should be consideration given to doing each and every webinar in-house rather than sponsoring a webinar. There are good reasons to sponsor a webinar in many cases, and we will talk about those. But companies do not need to be intimidated in delivering their own webinars. So the first step in that is you're going to need to define the cost of delivering your own webinar, internal costs, direct and indirect, and then the outsourcing, just that sponsor cost that you're going to pay. So again, let's just run through a couple of the main value propositions for each side of the equation, then I'll discuss those. So why would a company sponsor a webinar? Well, the organization offering the webinar may have a reach and level of engagement with your company's target audience you do not currently possess. So they may have a broad reach and engaged audience, and it may just be that it's not cost effective for you to build that engagement and reach the crowd that they're able to reach. It could also be the case that there's a lack of internal expertise and resources to execute or market a webinar effectively. Where I would caution here is I think many companies have a perceived lack of internal expertise and resources to do their own webinars, and I think the perception versus reality, there's often a disconnect there. And if companies actually look at on the cost side of things, and that their people internally, that they actually might have the resources there, and that cost of ownership for the webinar may not be as great as they think, especially when it's compared to the cost of sponsoring a webinar. And there are certain cases, as I mentioned, where there can be a lower lead acquisition cost if they already have the engaged audience, the right decision makers. But that's going to be a critical piece of your sponsor choice versus doing your own, is challenging the organization putting on the webinar of how engaged that audience is, and them showing proof to you of that engagement. So again, why would you deliver your own webinar? I'm going to come a little biased on the webinar side, I will confess, and that's kind of why we're here today. Webinar sponsorship costs, they can be high. They can be tens of thousands of dollars. And again, I mentioned earlier quality versus quantity. So if your organization is really focused on quality and you have a great sales process in place to convert the high-quality leads, webinars can be very compelling. I've had conversations with marketing leaders, and they basically told me, I want to sponsor a webinar. I just need 500 leads, and I don't really care if they convert. So I've actually heard that. So that's kind of a mindset, right? The quality versus quantity. So if you're leaning towards delivering your own webinar, you want to really focus on those leads and then how effective you are through that sales process. So those quality leads, converting those quality leads. So I always tell people, I can give you 1,000 names and contact information, but that's not going to close the deal. But if I give you a few high-quality leads and you close one of them, that's where you should be measuring your ROI. Another reason, again, this might be a misperception, the webinar technology is pretty user-friendly. We can't control the technology, and there are issues, but just using it, navigating around it, the learning curve is not as steep as you might think. And also, the cost of the technology is really not all that steep as well, especially if your webinar audience is going to be 100 or 25 people or less. So that technology is user-friendly, and it's pretty cost-effective as well. The next couple bullet points or things I'll talk about are all about ownership, and these are really key and big benefits to owning your own webinar. So if you deliver your own webinar, you own that registrant and attendee information. So I've been involved in many webinars where there's always this dance going back and forth. What type of information do I get? Do I get the emails? Do I get the addresses? What do I get? And you actually own that information. You can use that as you see fit, and that's really key, and that's something you should consider in sponsoring that webinar as well. Who owns that registrant and attendee information, and how can you use that, and how can you start to make those connections that lead to those deals? You also have ownership of the marketing messaging. So so there are times when you can be involved in a webinar that might not be sponsored, the way that you'd like to see it. You can see ineffective marketing messaging. So you can't really control on that message, and you also can't control how your brand is featured. So you can actually control how your brand is being associated and featured. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Content control is very critical. So you can control the quality of the content, but also the quality of the speakers. So in a little bit, we'll talk about some of the webinar pitfalls, and being able to control that content on the speaker front can be critical. If you're sponsoring on a webinar, sometimes you don't know what you're getting into, and your brand can be associated with speakers that aren't up to the quality of your organization, and that can actually cause damage to your brand and kind of turn off some of your potential leads. Like I mentioned, you also have branding control. And then also, if you think about it, being a good webinar sponsor can be just as costly as delivering your own webinar. So, so if you're a good sponsor, co-market, and do all those things, you got to look at the A versus B, sponsor versus deliver, and really take a look at, okay, I'm sponsoring and paying X, so what am I really getting out of that versus delivering that myself? Again, at the end of the day, it's essentially about closing deals, or if you have a probabilistic model, what's the probability of me closing those deals for me? So again, you're looking at, okay, looking at a webinar as a biz dev channel, it looks great. Okay, let's take a look at seminars first and just make sure that webinar is the right way to go on the surface in terms of cost. And then let's look at sponsor versus deliver and see if it makes sense for us to bring that webinar in-house. Can we drive the ROI that we want in terms of lead quality? But it also might be the case that you want to do some thought leadership and drive your traffic to your website or web pages, and a webinar can help do that as well. So now we'll shift to kind of some pain points for me around some of the common pitfalls that I've seen in my involvement of webinars. Later in the presentation, what I will do is I will share some links to some blogs that my organization has written, and one of those focuses on the webinar pitfalls. So those are kind of some things to avoid and common mistakes made out of the gate. I think one of the common mistakes that I've seen, and this is kind of like there's no foundation for webinar success, that people don't really understand the target webinar audience. So you have to be very clear on who you are trying to reach, the geography, the title, the seniority. So you have to get very specific on that demographic that you are trying to reach, and then how you're going to reach that demographic. So if you don't really understand, who you're trying to reach, trying to come up with how you effectively reach them and measure and monitor that, you're kind of dead out of the water there. I've also seen what I call the ill-conceived webinar. There's just a lack of clear objectives. So whether sponsoring or owning, someone in the marketing team will say, okay, we've got to do 4 webinars this quarter, so let's just do a webinar. And there's not enough thought put into, okay, what's that webinar going to focus on? What are the objectives? If we're trying to promote a product, thought leadership, are there other ways to accomplish this without a webinar? So there can be a lack of clear objectives on what's the purpose of the webinar, who are we trying to reach, and how are we measuring the ROI. So it almost comes to the point where, hey, this is in the budget, so we need to deliver or sponsor the webinar. Another common key and I hope I don't fall in this category, weak webinar speakers, and that's fairly common, unfortunately. The webinar market is pretty dense, but there are quite a few what I call weak webinar speakers. And there's also a blog where I talked about the weak webinar speakers and how to get some warning signs from them, because no matter how great the content that you have for your webinar is, how it's delivered is just as important as the great content. So just some kind of things to consider. Again, the first bullet point is inexperience as a speaker. That's not always a bad thing. It's just something to take note of. And then you'll want to make sure that that person has as much support as possible in being a speaker. So if it's a person internal to your organization, you want to make sure you give them the support. And also if you have a customer, right, you're doing a case study, which I said, which is the pure gold for webinars, you just want to make sure you make it as easy as possible for them. And in some cases, you'll actually want to consider preparing the slides for them, preparing them just to make it as easy as possible. A lot of webinar speakers are storytellers, so they'll kind of get off topic. So so the webinar will promise A, but then you'll get a storyteller, and he'll take it off on a tangent, and the person is kind of left with, ooh, these are my objectives, or they weren't met, and kind of detracts from the whole ROI there. This is kind of unavoidable in some cases, but I call it the wet fish personality. So even though it's a virtual presence, you can tell when someone has energy and passion for what they do. So if someone is very monotone, they don't have passion for that, that's something you might want to consider, because it's really hard to keep the webinar audience engaged, and so not having any passion for what you're speaking about is often detrimental to webinar success. And then another thing is to consider is, sometimes people are lured in by the attractiveness of having maybe a Fortune 50 or Fortune 100 speaker. However, that person could very well be overworked or underprepared. So even though you've got a Fortune 100 speaker, Fortune 50 speaker, and everyone comes to the webinar, well, if they're overworked and unprepared, they are not going to deliver a good performance for your webinar, and it's going to impact your ROI. So if you get someone that's delivering either weak content or gives weak delivery, that is going to cause a problem. So those are the first three. But like I said, a lack of understanding of the target webinar audience, I think, unfortunately, that's pretty common in today's market. Again, speaking to weak content, and this is, and we all have the tendency to do this, especially if it's our own webinar. And this is like the kiss of death for webinar salesies, or non-specific content that offers no takeaways or actionable advice. So it just destroys the value of the webinar. More and more today, people are really sensitive to that salesy or non-specific content. So if it's salesy or if it flies it, the content just continues to fly at 50,000 feet, and there's no real actionable advice. That's something that people don't really latch onto, and it doesn't do well to engaging your leads. So you want to get them to the show, but then you want to engage them to the show, teach them something, and leave them wanting more. So the best case scenario is to get the right audience, great content, great performance, and have them reaching out to you afterwards to facilitate that sales process. Another thing that I've seen common is what I call off-base marketing strategy, and that's kind of a function of an earlier point, not understanding your target audience. So for example, if my target audience is CFOs with 20 years of experience, I shouldn't be spending a lot of money investing on Tumblr, which is a social media, or Instagram, right? Places where those people are not and where they do not play. So you need to understand your constituency, where they are and what makes them pay attention and what causes them to engage and take actions that you want, which is to get to that registration page and have them actually decide to register for that webinar. I think this is also kind of related to an earlier point. Again, I've seen common webinar spend just for the sake of spending marketing dollars so they have money to spend. So that's just a taboo. If that's the momentum out of the gate, then it's kind of going to set the stage for a bad process. And then there can also be, if you're going to partner with a company, so a lot of times you'll engage another company or maybe a third party to help you deliver your webinar. If you engage with the wrong company, that can really hurt and if you expect them to do co-marketing, and also if you sponsor a webinar, partnering with the wrong company can really leave a bad taste in your mouth, and your branding is tied to them. And also I'll say, being a poor webinar partner, if you are going to make the investment and sponsor the webinar, there should be some co-marketing on your side, and you should do every effort to make sure your speakers are prepared. And so you are adding value to that webinar. Even if you're sponsoring it, companies that take ownership of that, it's critical for them. So I know you're paying in some sense for the other folks to bring folks to the party, but it's also valuable to engage your folks and bring them to the party as well. So those are some common webinar pitfalls. So now let's kind of reverse that. And I know some of these things seem like they overlap, but it's just a different way to kind of drive some key points home on what really makes a successful webinar. So again, I talked about achieving customer success, my little acronym CMEM. I think content is king for webinars. It's really what, I mean, the content, the way you market it attracts the folks, and then the quality and delivery is what makes a success. So content is king. The cat's meow is information that makes audience members better at their jobs. So if you're able to make that decision maker a better accountant, even a better marketing professional, if you're able to make someone better at their job, that is really, the cat's meow to them. So it's all about that thought leadership. And then as I mentioned, it's not just about what the content is, it's also a function of how that content is delivered. So you want to have that content delivered by a knowledgeable and engaging speaker. And then also, I mean, it's really tough, but deliver it in an engaging content in an interactive format. So at the very least, have Q&A, and then also, I'm not doing it in this case, but sometimes it's great to have some polling questions in there. So if there's a way to make the format interactive, and again, sometimes folks ask for questions going up. So if there's any way to get some input from your audience on what they want to see as well, and then really reference that, in your content, and be mindful of that, right, in that content, and that's going to really engage them on that front. So the C in CMEM is all about content, and content is key, and that is really the foundation, for marketing webinar success. So in my experience, webinars that have had, that solid content presented in their concise way, the webinar registration numbers and the quality of the leads that come in are just outstanding. If you don't have content, it's kind of a, it's really an uphill struggle. And the next one, M, is marketing, and I think this is where folks probably struggle the most, and that's why, some folks such as myself, maybe offer some value on the consulting side for marketing, just because there really is an art to marketing and drawing people into the webinars. So again, I mentioned before, you need to really define the target audience. You need to have clear and concise messaging, so some verbosity. I'm guilty of this as well, but you have your marketing speak. You just want to really lay out clearly and concisely, if you come to this webinar, you are going to get X, Y, Z. So what is the value? What is the value proposition for you to come to this webinar? So what is it that you get out of it? And then I think it's a good idea to design a custom webinar registration page so you drive people to your website, take them to that registration page, convert them. It's got your branding there. It's got a lot of information on the speakers and so forth, so they can also learn more about your company. So I think that is a key point. And then another point on the marketing side, we'll talk about this in a moment or so, is that you need lead time. So you can't really kick off the marketing unless you have that registration page up. So getting that custom webinar registration page up as soon as possible is going to be key in driving your webinar success. And then also you want to give it its due. You need to identify and leverage the right marketing channels. And I think this is probably the biggest challenges for companies, especially those who are just looking to move into the webinar as a business development channel. So just go over a few of the channels, and then I'll comment on some of them that have been the most effective in my experience, and some that have not been the most effective and why. So direct email. Direct email, obviously, there's a cost to reaching out to your contacts, but it generally seems to do the most conversion. So that direct email, that direct message. What I will tell you from my experience is that marketing multiple events in the same email doesn't seem to work very well. So the best things that I found for direct email are, boom, the email title is very compelling. It's sent at the time of day, right, the right time of day, so not too early in the morning, not too late in the afternoon, and it's really focused on that, on that event itself, and doesn't have 4 or 5 other ones on there. Other great marketing channels are newsletters. So you have your internal newsletters. So if you have newsletters for your customer, it's often effective to have a little article or a blurb about the content of which your webinar is focused and link them out to the webinar. Another great thing on the newsletter front is organizations that serve your constituency, like associations, like the Chamber of Commerce, right? So so getting your webinar information into those newsletters can be a key marketing channel. So again, if you understand where your constituents play and what engages them, you can use those as well. And other marketing channels are social media, and this really depends on your target audience, right? So you can use LinkedIn. A great resource on LinkedIn is the groups in LinkedIn. I call that the keys to the candy store. So if you can get into the groups where your constituents are and those decision makers, so if you want CFOs, there's a big CFO group. If you're targeting folks in a certain geographic area, company size, there are groups. So you can join those groups, and then you can actually reach out to them depending on the level of your LinkedIn ownership. You can also use Twitter. What I would caution on is putting too much effort into social media if your audience doesn't play there. So I've had a lot of experience trying to market to CFOs, and some of these social media vehicles, they really don't play there very well. So you have to be real careful on your conversions. So we'll talk about this in a moment. What you'll want to do is you'll want to set up your metrics, right? So what are my metrics? So for each channel I go into, in each campaign, okay, I'm looking for website visits, I'm looking for conversions, so to look at those. And then also give yourself enough lead time so you can be nimble. So I can say, okay, I want to try LinkedIn, Twitter, maybe some Google ads, and then say, oh, that's not working, so you can adjust. Another thing that I found key is if you can engage, this is very difficult at times, if you can engage others involved to co-market your webinar by webinar partners, to kind of share that burden of engaging their audience. So I've had, I've had the fortunate experience to work with some great webinar partners, and they've actually, doubled and tripled the webinar numbers just because they're willing to put their shoulder behind that. And sometimes it's worth it to let other organizations be involved in your webinar if they deliver great content, so they can bring folks to the party, right? So you might want to bring your auditor or someone else that you have a relationship with into the party, and they reach your constituents as well, and not really charge them to do that, but just have them on board, and then they'll bring those leads for you as well. So, and then also, marketing by affiliate partners. What I mean by that is, again, I talked about reaching organizations that serve your constituency. So using external channels and affiliate partners lets folks, and so does social media, do a one-to-many marketing outreach, which is really key if you can make that happen. Direct email, you're doing hand-to-hand combat. So in general, I mean, it's much more effective to do the one-to-many. You're reaching multiple people at once, so you're not having that direct outreach to folks. And then also it's not coming directly from you, so it's coming to someone else that also has that brand. So you can leverage their brand as well in reaching out. A lot of times, the organizations, the association, the Chicagoland Chamber, having your name associated with them helps and can be an effective marketing channel. Again, I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. You want to define the success metrics for each marketing channel. So again, a lot of times this is done. You do this in Google Analytics. So a couple of the key things that I've always looked at are traffic to the registration page or a specific web page and actual registrations. You can actually set up goals in Google Analytics to track where the registrations have come from. And also what you can do is if you are putting hyperlinks in your marketing programs, you can put what's called UTM coding on there, so you can track exactly everything that came from a specific marketing program. So for example, you would want to say, okay, I did this on LinkedIn on this date for this webinar, and you can actually track that in Google Analytics. So that allows you to really get the most out of your, I'll call it your asset allocation for your marketing channels, and that's very, 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 very powerful. And I think And the other thing that you can do if you're a sponsor, you should actually ask the person putting on the event to help you with that and track. So if you're going to co-market, what are the efforts? All of us who are marketing professionals know that each and every marketing outreach to our constituency is very valuable, and it's very important that we get the ROI out of that direct outreach. So that's very important across the organization. Another common key is adequate lead time. So for a webinar, I generally, rule of thumb is like to have 5 weeks or more lead time. What does that mean? That means that the actual event is up, registration page is up and posted 5 weeks out. The more time that you have, the more levers that you can pull and more adjustments that you can make to your marketing programs. And then you may want to engage other partners or just engage other channels. And then I'll talk about this also later. The marketing should not end after the webinar. Where I see a lot of folks don't spend the time here because they have so many webinars. You should leverage the content after the webinar, and we'll talk about that in our last letter there for M. It's momentum. So the marketing associated with the webinar and that marketing, the ROI from that webinar does not end after the webinar. In my mind, the content produced by the webinar and the questions produced come out of that webinar that you answer and allows you to engage with your leads is all part of that. Is all part of that success. And if you just kind of end it right after the webinar, you say, okay, I got these leads, that's kind of it. You're leaving quite a bit on the table, I think, in terms of deals and certainly moving folks along in that sales cycle. As far as the E, we'll go for execution. And this is one of my favorites in talking about adding value. It's all about people, process, and technology on the webinar side. In some cases, quality event professionals deliver competitive advantage. So if you get that right person, been there, done that, knows the ins and outs, knows how to engage the speakers, knows how to run everything, that can be pure gold. And as I mentioned before, in terms of people, prepared speakers drive execution. You want to get those presentations in early. So to make sure you want to prepare those speakers. You actually want to have a speaker call with them to make sure they understand the objectives of the content, drive them on that, actually have a dry run with the speakers, and get all that a week or two before the webinar so you can really drive that superior execution. Always key to execution is process, and there can be a lot of steps here, but document the entire process from A to Z, and then make sure you're assigning the right people. So so in certain cases, I've seen the CEO of the company is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So make that investment to document right from inception all the way through to the post-webinar, who does what, and get that process down so you can optimize that process. And then in terms of technology, you want to discover which platform is right for your company. So here we're using GoToWebinar and WebEx. So discover which platform is the best fit for your company, and then make the investment to understand that technology to drive that efficient execution for your webinar. So then we'll talk about kind of the last piece of that, which is M, and this is, again, where I see a lot of folks are leaving things on the table. So as far as, the leads acquired, okay, how are we going to push those along in the sales process? So there has to be specific marketing programs which need to measure the ROI to follow up with those. So programs should be, different programs should be attendees versus registrants. Some may need an email versus a phone call. There may be ways to follow up with social media, way to engage those folks. So maybe a LinkedIn connection request, a follow on Twitter. So again, I see a lot of times people acquire the leads. Even if they get good leads, they get lost, through that post process, which is still webinar related. The webinar kind of opens the door to that next step, and then how you engage those folks on that next step is key to driving the ROI to your webinar involvement. And then you want to leverage the webinar content. It's very common to have a post-webinar recording. So even if you're sponsoring a webinar, you should ask for that, post that on your site. You should use that to convey thought leadership. So you should use that. You can use that post-webinar recording, link people back to that on LinkedIn, Twitter, and your newsletters, all your internal and also external vehicles. And then of course, along the same lines, you drive leads to the recording. And what you can also do is put up a little fence. So if people want to download the recording, they have to give you your name, email. so you can get that out in multiple channels so you can drive leads, leverage that content, and then also you can use the webinar content to deliver content at conferences. So maybe you can use the great content you've produced to speak at another conference that has your target audience. So you can use that as well to further that thought leadership. You can also leverage your webinar content in creating a blog. So you can create a blog and use that and drive people back to your website and mine leads that way. So there are several ways to leverage that webinar content. So that's why it's so important for your involvement in the webinar to really value that content, make sure it's quality, because it kind of can be the gift that keeps on giving, right, if you do it right on the content side. So let me just take a step back here and really hit home on these CMEM couple slides here. Boom, content. You want to own the quality, ensure speaker quality, and you want to proactively facilitate that speaker preparation. On the marketing side, you want to identify the right marketing channels, and those can be both internal and external, and sometimes the external ones can be just as valuable as the internal ones. You want to create success metrics for each channel, and like I said, the common ones there might be the web page visits and also the conversion, and you can put Google Analytics around there to measure those things that you want to measure in terms of the effectiveness of marketing programs. And marketing want to engage your audience, not annoyed by too much contact, so don't send them 3 emails a week for 4 weeks outside the webinar. So you have to be careful on how you choose to engage your audience, and that's why your message is so important. And then you want to design and deliver post-webinar marketing programs, because oftentimes those are really the keys in getting a deal closed, and that's where people leave money on the table. Some of these things seem like common sense, but sometimes they're not for certain, for certain people, just because they're doing so many webinars. You want to cherish your leads, pursue quality versus quantity, and again, develop programs to effectively engage categories. So don't give everyone the same message. Ensure speaker quality, again, facilitate speaker preparation. On execution, people do matter. So best-in-class events professionals are worth their weight in gold. And then momentum. The ultimate ROI is closing deals, and that always happens post-webinar. So I just want to share a couple of resources. I'll be sending the slides out to folks, but all these resources have a deeper dive into some of the keys to success that I've mentioned. So one kind of delves into the ABCs. One of them is kind of a little play on humor. Why events are like nails on a chalkboard. One focuses on sponsorship. So if you're looking at sponsorships, it tells keys to whether or not a sponsorship is a right idea and how to shop for those. The warning signs of a terrible event speaker. Leveraging your customer success stories, as I mentioned. Customer success stories are like gold in a webinar, can be an effective channel to really deliver some value from that. And then event ROI, what specific tactics to maximize the number of quality leads that you receive for your involvement in a webinar. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for the Q&A session and see if we have any questions from the audience, and then I'll make some closing thoughts. So again, if you have any questions for me, please feel free to ask those in the questions area in your GoToWebinar control panel. So I'll answer the questions that we have queued up there, and I might dismiss you early. So I encourage you to ask your questions. So I have a few questions keyed up here. So like I mentioned this a little earlier, so someone's asking, what have you found to be the most effective marketing channels for webinars? For me, direct emails have been effective, but the caveat there is they have to be concise and there can't be too many direct emails. And also LinkedIn has been very effective, getting in those groups and sending people messages from the groups. If you're a group, if you're in the same group as someone and they're a member, that is a way to reach out to them and let them know about that webinar. Okay, next question. How do you ensure the quality of webinar speakers? That is a great question. So first of all, obviously they have to have the qualifications up front. I gave several keys that might lead to a bad speaker, but I think if nothing else, just having a phone call with the speakers, discussing the content with them, and actually helping them deliver the content, letting them know what you want, and being a resource for them in any way to help make the process easier for them. Okay, next question. How do you get webinars to take ownership of their involvement? Sometimes that one's a little bit tricky, but at the end of the day, you have to convey to them how their contributions, you have to convey to them how their marketing efforts are going to be worth it for them. So convey to them how their involvement is going to improve the quality of the webinar, and it's going to increase the number of attendees, which is going to make the event better, and also getting them to take ownership of the speakers as well. So just having that kind of I don't know, the meeting of the minds there, so to speak. So that often helps. So if you're a marketing person, you want to directly connect to the other marketing person in all the other organizations, so you can talk the same language and make sure there's a proactive approach to the webinar partners taking ownership of their involvement, because webinars can offer a great opportunity. You got to make sure all the parties understand that and realize the more effort that they put in, the more they're going to get out of it. Next question, how much time does it take to implement and learn GoToWebinar or WebEx to deliver webinars? Learning the technology really it doesn't really take all that much time. If you really sit down, you can get yourself up to speed in actually a few hours. And the cost really, is not that great. So the cost is not really cost prohibitive to do that. So. Okay, next question is, what are the best ways to drive interaction during the webinar? One way is to have, the Q&A. The other way, as I mentioned, are the polling questions. So, so I think, having those polling questions, if that's the right way. So, well, maybe I should have done that here, right? So if I had a polling question, then taking those answers and speaking to those questions, so that way folks feel like, okay, we're looking at things, we're engaged here. You ask them, and maybe how many webinars have you done? What do you use? What are your biggest challenges in webinars? I think polling questions it can be a key way to make people, drive interaction during the webinar. As I mentioned before, sometimes you can get input from the audience on what they want to see beforehand, and that kind of inspires them to be engaged, and that will inspire them to ask questions. So it's all about getting folks to ask questions. Yeah, so so there are other technologies out there. Someone's asking a question, for GoToWebinar versus Google Hangouts. So so it's just a matter of of really what you're trying to accomplish, and also the number of folks that you want, and also the functionality there, right? So like I said, one of the cool things about GoToWebinar, and I'm not an expert on Google Hangouts, but one of the things that you can do is you can actually record the webinar, and then that's a great way to engage folks after the webinar. So you can share that with folks. They can actually hear your content as your slides are driven, and also the polling questions side of it. But of course, if you have a small group, or you're doing a very small group demo, then then there are other tools to use. You can even use GoToMeeting or some other tools to use it. I'll talk GoToWebinar because that's what I know, and I have used WebEx in the past. So there are pluses and minuses with all those. But again, it's all about the functionality, right? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? What's the level of engagement that you'd like, and what is the number of people that you expect to attend? So I've got one final question here in the queue. And again, feel free, anyone else, to ask any questions if you have any at this time. What are the most common issues experienced in delivering a webinar? I could probably do a webinar on those things. There are certain quirks in the technology. Often you'll have slide handoffs, excuse me. So you're trying to pass slide control back and forth. Oftentimes you'll have people have trouble just logging into the technology itself. You'll have people who are speakers. They will leave their mute button on and be talking, so getting them to talk. There are times when there's latency in the slides, so people will have this fun little thing, going back and forth on the slides. And of course, there are minor connectivity issues. So those are just, some of the most common issues. Some of those you can control, and some of those you can't. So for the connectivity, you want to make sure you have multiple connections. You can also have multiple people on the webinar. So anytime you can do things to mitigate those, and a lot of it's about speaker preparation. So I have a great story. from my past. So I had a very, very experienced speaker. They had their handouts printed out, so we lost our internet connection, and this person just kept on going. And this was very early in the game, 4 years ago or so, so I wasn't as prepared as I should have been right that long ago, given my inexperience, and so she just kept on going, right? She was very prepared. She knew what to do. She had her slides. So it took us, a few minutes to get the webinar back up and going, but she just picked up, and that was awesome, and that was because she was prepared. And you just need to let people know that things happen. So the important thing is to just keep that content flowing there. So with that, I'll go ahead and close the Q&A session. Again, if anyone has any questions they'd like to take offline or dive a little bit deeper, I'll have my contact information on the slides, and I'd be happy to have those conversations. So, I'd like to put a point on the content here. So, webinars can offer companies a great business development channel. You need to understand the sponsor versus deliver webinar value proposition for your company, and it might just be a mix, right? Certain ones you want to sponsor, certain ones you want to deliver. Know your target audience and know where they play and how to engage them. Again, that's the next point. You want to define specific metrics. And then at the end of the day, superior content, marketing, execution, and momentum is really what optimizes the marketing ROI. And another point I'd like to add here is there's no reason to be intimidated by owning your own webinar. The learning curve is not that steep. It can be cost effective, and it can save a lot of money on that marketing side spend. So just as a reminder, I'll be sending each of you a link to today's presentation. I encourage you to reach out to me again if you have any comments regarding the content or would like to learn more. I would like to thank the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce again for their support in marketing the webinar. And finally, I would like to thank the audience for your valuable time. And please make the rest of your day great, and take care, everyone. Thank you.